At the highest level, all needs should include a problem statement and a desired outcome. So when we write a need statement, we don't just write them randomly. We try and write them in a common syntax or a consistent syntax so that we can compare them and test and validate them later on. I also like to include an owner, which might be the subject or population that is affected by or cares about this need, so that when I look at that need later on in a spreadsheet perhaps, I know, who am I talking to about this? Who is the person who cares most about this? Or sometimes the multiple people who care about this. It may be a specific stakeholder or a subset of a population. So it could be, like our nurses, operating room nurses. There are lots of nurses. Operating room nurses are a particular type of nurse. It could be plumbers. It could be a subset of plumbers, which are people doing commercial building HVAC engineering, which is a very specific subset of just being a general plumber. So we have an owner or a population that we're going to target with this need statement. So I like to include that. Need statements need to be written in a common syntax, as I said, not conveying a solution. And the classic one we see here is needs a 1/4-inch drill. You may remember this example. Well, why do you need a 1/4-inch drill? Well, because I want to put just a shelf up. Why do you want to put a shelf up? Because I want to display a picture of my grandmother. So what you need is to display a picture of your grandmother, not a better 1/4-inch drill. So when I'm preparing need statements, I'm careful not to embed a solution in there, because that really sort of limits the creativity that a team could exercise around the problem. At a minimum, need statements should include an owner, that's that stakeholder typically, an action verb, the thing that's being carried out, preparing, measuring, cutting, a desired outcome, the thing that we're trying to affect. That might be patient discomfort in my case, or it might be waste of ingredients, or it might be efficiency of a process. And then a vector of measurement. Which way are we trying to go with this? Are we trying to minimize it, maximize it, lengthen it, shorten it? So some vector of measurement, so that later on, when this piece of paper with a need statement on it arrives in a brainstorm, and you're all going to have fun brainstorming around it, you know which way you're trying to make this thing go. And sometimes, but not always, but often it's useful to put context in there as to caused by or during or when such and such is going on, so that when we look at that need statement later on in our brainstorm, you've got a little bit of meat on the bones to explain to people, so sometimes nurses in operating rooms are trying to open packets. They don't want to throw the contents across the room because of sterility and issues like that. They've got gloves on, but they can't get the packaging material to separate. How could we innovate around that? So context is sometimes useful as well. Let me try and bring this alive and give you some examples. In this case, nurses need to more consistently sterilize what are things called central line hubs during line use activities. That's when they're giving a drug or taking a sample from a line, in order to reduce bloodstream infections, because bloodstream infections are quite bad news in a hospital. So you can see that there's a subject, a vector of measurement or a direction we're trying to go in, the thing that's being carried out, sterilization. And then there's some context around the what and the why, and then a desired outcome in order to reduce bloodstream infections. And it could be bloodstream infections in ICU patients or in all patients. You could narrow the scope that way. So that's a medical example. Let's look at a different one. Bakers need to measure the volume of grated ingredients as they grate in order to eliminate the need to conduct secondary measuring steps when baking a carrot cake. Remember, we saw that example earlier on. Let's look at another one. Auto mechanics need to remove oil sump plugs without prematurely initiating an uncontrolled oil flow. So you can again see that most of the elements are there. It's a consistent need statement. And finally, DIYers, people like mums and dads at home doing DIY, need to accurately cut, there's our verb, drywall patches to fit odd-shaped holes, because when we get holes in drywall, they're never perfectly square the first time, without, when they're repairing drywall, in order to reduce multiple steps. Because what you actually see happen is people have to try it, cut it some more, try it, cut it some more. Oh, I cut it too much, I need to cut another one, and it carries on. So there's another example following the same consistent syntax, again without conveying a solution. I'm not saying how we're going to do that, I'm just saying here's what we need to happen, here's the problem we're going to go after. I want to bring you back and just remind you of the concept of the ladder of abstraction, and we used food in this case down to a very specific type of pizza. And that ladder of abstraction from not very abstract, very specific at the bottom, to quite abstract and broad at the top. It's important to not write need statements that are too broad, because it's really not helpful. You encompass all of your research into one giant need statement. So, for example, need to cure world hunger. Well, yes, that is a valid and really important need. But could we break it down? Could we be less abstract? Could we say, so what we actually need to do is plant seeds exactly 2 inches deep. We need to water them with 30 milliliters of water every day. We need to know when they germinate. We need to know the right point when they harvest. We need to stop animals eating the crops in the growing process. So those are further down in the ladder of abstraction, and they make for a series of brainstorms that ultimately would roll up into that curing world hunger need. But they're much more easy to grapple with, and they're much more specific, particularly for engineers to get their teeth into. The one that I really hate and implore you to avoid is needs to be easy to use. I'm sure that's something that we've all seen in product requirements or in project descriptions, needs to be easy to use. But now you begin to think, well, what does easy to use mean? What about it needs to be easy to use? What would constitute easier? So probably there are multiple things inside easy to use that we could go after that would ultimately contribute to its ease of use. But just giving a brainstorm around how do we make things easier to use, too broad, too hard, not really very helpful. So remember the ladder of abstraction when you're writing need statements, and don't turn them into cure world hunger. So a reminder, an owner, an action, the thing we're trying to carry out, the outcome, the person or people or population that we're trying to affect, and a direction that we're trying to go in, and any richness or context that we can add so that when we go after it later on in a brainstorm, we can describe it to our colleagues.